So for this week's podcast, we said that for the second episode of this 3 parts, like kind of series thing for the criminal justice system, we said that we're going to talk about police abolition versus reform and just kind of discuss the different options and our different opinions on it. So you guys can kind of hear what we think and the different like paths that could be taken. Last week, we spoke about the criminal justice system, the structure. I mean, if you didn't hear that and you want to be a little bit more informed, maybe you won't understand this week as much, go check it out on our YouTube channel. So just go and look at that. It will just educate you a bit more. But anyway, this week we're talking about abolition. So Silla, Amal, we've got this problem of the police being very brutal and the system being corrupt. And I mean, there's two options of just trying to find a way to change and like do little things to make it better, or just completely getting rid of the system. Like Silla, tell me what you think about this entire process.
Yes, I personally believe that in regards to the US criminal justice system, abolition is the way that they need to go. Because as we've seen, they've tried and tried and tried and failed, should I add, with different reforms. So abolition is basically where we will disband, disempower and disarm the police. So that's my standpoint, and we'll go into more depth about that in a bit. So Amal, what's your standpoint?
I mean, I feel like I'm sitting on the fence here, really. On one hand, whilst I feel like we shouldn't completely just abolish the entirety of the police system, I also do feel like there's changes in which they need to be made, but such changes coming from cutbacks within the military expenditure and the money that's given into funding the policing systems, rather than actually changing their behaviour. Because as we've seen, like historically, nothing has changed from telling the police we need to change the way that they're trained and such, because that's clearly not worked, and we still have people dying as a cause of police brutality.
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys to an extent. Like there's points both of you have said which I agree with. However, from my perspective, I'm thinking more short term. So if you have abolition, yeah, it's a great option for the long term kind of future of this of American US. Sorry, I'm bugging now. I don't know I'm bugging, but it's a good future for the US there. But if you haven't, if you're looking short term, then I don't really see the solution there, because regardless of whether it's abolition or reform, the people who are going to be in power are the government, and they're making decisions regardless of which option you take. So I feel like reform, with a mutually exclusive body, you can make like choices without bias. I think that's the path that should be taken, because then obviously reform, if it doesn't work, then you can go into abolition from there, and that just leads to a more steady kind of path. I mean, Silla, I know you're very set on abolition, like you're far right with abolition, whereas Amal, you're, as you said, you're in the middle. So Silla, just go into a little bit more depth about why you're so set on abolition rather than reform.
Yeah, so Jonathan, as you just said there, you said reform, we can, and if it fails, we can go into abolition, when abolition should be what it should be. Because if we look at the different strategies in place for reform, so we have body cameras, implicit bias training, jailing killer cops, and just complete changes to the current system. But if we look at what has happened, there's been no change in the actual system. So when they introduced body cameras, this was pretty much after the death of Mike Brown. It was a way of them trying to sort of hold police more accountable for their actions. But if we look at some of the videos, you hear a lot of police officers saying, just turn off your camera, turn your camera this way, let's not do this. So they will abuse these reforms. And also when you look at, for example, jailing the killer cops, again, that's a short-term solution, because there will be more police in that system that will do that again. And I think we've gone beyond the point of reform in the American system, because we're trying to fix a broken system, and it's just not going to work.
One question for you though on that, in regards to what you just said a second ago. So you said that reform's not working. With reform, obviously, there's got to be someone who's they're making the reform happen. So they're in the power saying, oh, this needs to change, this needs to change. Killer cops need to go to prison. Body cams need to be. Who is directing this?
For reform?
Yeah, for reform. Who's directing this?
So the government. And because the government want to keep the current system, they won't do things that will entail abolition. So
So in terms of the whole discussion then, is reform the problem, or is it the government that, like, what do you think about it? Is reform the problem? Is it abolition we need, or is it just the whole system is corrupt?
So the whole both basically, because I think reform is it's almost a dichotomy, because you're saying it's an incremental approach essentially, because you're recognizing that that's a problem. You're recognizing that there's a problem with the current system, but you're only going to touch its surface level because you're keeping the current system that is causing all this harm, and you're not actually going to the root of the problem and dismantling the system that is causing Black people to be disadvantaged, ethnic minorities to be disadvantaged. So I think reformists ultimately they don't want change, if you think about it like that. Amal, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, because obviously with people who are pro-abolition like yourself, Scylla, they recognize that historically the reforms do not reduce the power of the police, and I think ending police violence through more training schemes and other regimes of such nature, it's virtually impossible. I feel like what needs to be taken further from this point on is perhaps looking at a different society, which is built on cooperation instead of individualism, in this sense of placing the power onto police officers. So like Jonathan was saying earlier about maybe perhaps, because we know that the reform comes from the government, but then how about opposing the idea where we can have people in charge for different sections within the community? But then I guess on the other hand, if we want to look at it the way you are, Scylla, I feel like if we abolish the police, I guess you could say the Amy Coopers of the world, quote unquote, they won't have a chance to weaponize against Black people with. So I think from there we can make the standpoint change, because only then, what else is there to fall back on? And then, these police brutality cases, you could see them decreasing. But again, it's something we won't know, because for generations, the only thing we have known within the community is relying on our police system as our safety net almost.
Exactly, because that's why I think people tend to see abolition as something that isn't tangible and something that is somewhat of a utopia. Because as you said, we've only had a system where we've only had the police. So anything that sort of wants to go away from that seems impossible, or seems like it won't be practical. When in actual fact, we don't know how it will work because we haven't tried it yet. So I think that essentially we need to look into abolition, because the current system is we can see it's flawed.
With abolition though, the thing with abolition is inevitably abolition is going to cost a lot more money than reform will cost. So if we get into this stage of abolition where we're getting rid of, we're scrapping the entire police force, we get to the stage where we've introduced something new and that doesn't work too, then what's going to happen then?
But Jonathan, in what nature, sorry Scylla, what nature are you talking about reform though? In what sense? Do you mean as in like to revise the whole, like the policing institution? Or because I feel like defunding, if we're talking about defunding, that one can cover a spectrum of demands, from outright just abolishing policing to either restructuring / reforming the policing issues and stuff.
Yeah, because if we look at, sorry Jonathan, if we look at reform, you said that like more money would go into abolition, but with reform a lot of money goes into it, and you're pouring more money to give room for them to make the same mistakes.
So we have to learn history, I guess.
Isn't a lot more money going to be needed to start up a completely new system? Because if we've not got police, you have to take into consideration what other system can you make that covers all the different varieties. Because people don't just call police when they're in violent situations. They call police for many different situations as well. And if we're going to abolish this system and start a new one, we're going to need to find another system that can cover everything. And that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be cheap, because you're going to need to provide jobs for people, you're going to need to provide them with resources to do what they need to do, and everything's going to have to come the same way that the system has been set up. The same things are going to need for the next one, but it's just going to be the thought of, okay, so these people have been trained, or these people are doing things differently because they haven't got the mentality of, I've got power, let me just abuse it. That's my opinion on abolition. I feel like it's going to be a very expensive procedure, and you're kind of jumping in the deep end there because you're not 100% sure it's going to work. So you could be left for a period of time with a defunded police force, and while the police are defunded, you could find people taking advantage of that. And while people are taking advantage of that, we're waiting maybe, 20, 30 years until a new system can be updated and put in place. And then we're kind of left with not much to work with from there.
See, I think when you've mentioned defunding there, I think you sort of have the point that defunding would just mean we cut all the money from the police and just leave it. But defunding, what is underneath that term is where money is redistributed to the sectors where it requires it. So communities, education. Because if you look at the root cause of most crime, it's because they turn to illegitimate means to have different things that they need. So in communities that are run down, they will turn to robbery because their communities aren't, society doesn't help those communities. Society hasn't provided a basis for them to function properly. So they let out their anger and everything else. So defunding essentially is how the money will be redistributed into places that matter. Because if we keep putting money into the police, it just means that the situation will get worse. Amar, what's your viewpoint?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because with Jonathan, what you said about how it could potentially take, let's say 20 to 30 years for us to actually see a change with this, because you've said we need to, cut back the police department. But I feel like we need to ask ourselves, what does defunding actually involve, because if we look at, for example, let me give an example, 2019 alone, what was it? The USA spent like around, I want to say, was it $800 billion just on military forces alone? And if we think about how that money can be divided into funding other things, so we need to ask ourselves, like, there's certain steps we can take. For example, defunding the police, what would we have to do? That would require things like taking away the platform that these white supremacists hold. Second of all, rejecting any proposed expansions to police budgets within the government. And then we have to look at demilitarizing communities, freeing people from jails and prisons. And by that, I mean sort of, involuntary confinement, or including people who are detained in immigrant centers and stuff like that. But then also, like Scylla then said, now to come to my point, is investing in community self-government, the promotion of neighborhood councils and assessing community needs, and therefore prioritizing those who are marginalized within society. So, for example, Black people. So there's like many steps. We can't just pinpoint and say, oh, you know what, defunding police, it will be costly. And yes, I'm saying it will be costly, but we have to actually break down the different segments to actually see what we mean by defunding the police.
But when it comes to the community, though, you guys are saying the money that we're taking from the police and maybe the military too, we should put that into the community. I mean, a lot of neighborhoods in America, when they're deprived, they turn to crime. But there's another window there too. Like, the reason why they turn to crime as well is because it's easy money. So drug dealing, easy money, not much effort, but there's a high return from it. It's easy money, okay? And then if you look at it from another perspective, if you gave more money to the communities, so Black people that have equal rights to white people, that's going to cause a lot of chaos, because you know how many racists are in America. Like, you know how many people in America are against Black people having equal rights to white people. So if you have a situation where the communities and the schools and everything are providing equal opportunities for Black people to excel, equal opportunities for extracurricular activities, then that's going to cause some form of uprising from white people. And if there's no police, so to say, or any form of group to defend against it, then don't you think that's going to lead to some form of just complete, I don't even know how to explain it. Like, the entire society will just fall apart because there's nothing to control it.
So a few points that I want to pick out that you said. So I think one thing that we need to sort of stop doing is comparing ourselves to what the white people will do, what they will think and stuff. Because again, that it goes down to how society is structured. We have this idea that whiteness is what should be compared to, but we should be focusing on ourselves. And the point where you said about the police and how they're going to defend, do they defend us in the first place? They're the ones that are killing us, And I just don't think that you can sort of have that idea of how the police can help us in the communities. Because if you look at community policing, which is a type of reform, it doesn't do anything but put more Black people in prison. It's not, community policing was designed to protect neighborhoods, but in actual fact, it doesn't protect neighborhoods because you're taking the people out of the neighborhoods and into prisons. So yeah, Amma, what do you think?
Yeah, but I mean, that's what I'm saying. It kind of backs my earlier point about saying how we need to, I guess, reduce the whole numbers of people in prisons and asking ourselves why they're actually in prison. So things like policing and neighborhood watchers, I guess you could call it. If you reduce things like that, because then some may argue that that's what takes up our policing, or like the money that's given to police forces. Do you know what I'm trying to say? And it's, how do I explain this? It's basically like we shouldn't, it's very problematic to say, oh, but it's going to cause an uproar by defunding the police, because then white people are going to feel some sort of way because black people are now equal to them. It shouldn't even be a case, like, why is it that we have to compare the way just humans genuinely are treated based on the color? So we have to sort of upscale it to how white people are. If they're treated like black people, no, the whole point of everything, even since the whole George Floyd thing caused this movement to sort of come back to life, if I say it like that, because that's what's happened, is because we're trying, that's why Black Lives Matter exists, because we're just trying to get that equality for all colours. It's not really a sense of we need to think about what we're doing with the policing system, because so we can upscale it so that white people are treated the same as black people. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Exactly. Because Jonathan, you also said about how, what if it causes an uproar? What if it causes like unrest? But that's the only way that we're going to achieve equality, because you can't have things at a level playing field. You can't have things peaceful, because it's just not going to work like that.
Yeah, I hear you guys. And I agree with some of the points you're saying, but what I don't think we can ignore is, as much as we want black people to be equal, if we look at this current day, this day and age, the reason why America is corrupt is because black people aren't equal. That's the reason why there's corruption. That's the reason why this entire Black Lives Matter movement is happening and will continue to happen for who knows how long, until we do get equality. But what I'm trying to say is, going back to this entire point, so what you guys are saying, your main point is, what I'm hearing is, defunding is the way. So taking the money from the police and distributing it into other areas, which will then make a bigger difference. But ultimately, can you not argue that if you're defunding the police and taking the money away, that is a short-term solution to the trauma that is going on right now? So the defunding, can that not be classed under reform? Because it's a change, not necessarily a change to behavior or the anything else to the police, but it's a change in the sense that it is preventing them from doing the things they were doing before, because they haven't got the resources, and that means they haven't got the power anymore, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, like preventing them from what they already do is abolition, because you're not allowing them to follow that same procedure and structure that they've already had. So like defunding is sort of surface level abolition. So but it's starting the process.
Why not reform?
See, okay, if we look at
with the behavior, Jonathan, so we're training the police officers to obviously not have the bias when it comes to who they're trying to restrain, who they're trying to arrest. That only changes the overall behavior of policing. Whereas defunding, we're talking about the physical cutbacks from them, which will then inadvertently change their behavior. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
That's fair enough.
Because reform, like Jonathan, you can't reform the current system in the US, because you're reproducing and legitimizing the same system that has disadvantaged all black people over the years. The same system, you can't have that system in place without.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it'll be a perpetual cycle. America's been having reforms since the dawn of time. They've reformed and reformed and reformed, and nothing has come to pass. Nothing has changed. It's the same.
But where I disagree with you is that I personally feel like, regardless of whether it is, as you say, Amal, cutbacks or whatever, I feel like reform is change in the short term. That's what I think reform is. Whatever definitions are out there, reform, whenever you hear the word reform, it's change. It's not keeping it the same, it's changing it. That's what reform is. Mm-hmm. So,
surely... I mean, example though, like give, so okay, short time, give an example.
Okay, so let me think of something. Say for instance, we had you have a school system or something, you're going to reform it. Like a change in the school system could be that instead of people taking GCSEs in year 10, they're going to take it in year 9 instead. That's a change, isn't it? That's a reform.
Yeah, but that's a reform, but you still have the same school system. You've just changed something within that system.
You still have the same school system, yeah? But what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
inevitably, reform will go into abolition if the right actions are taken. So surely the defunding and stuff, which is happening, which is preventing the police from doing what they're doing, because they can't do the same stuff they're doing if they haven't got the funds for it. They can't be shooting people up if they can't afford the weapons. How are they doing that? And then in the short term, that still provides like some form of I don't know, like some watch over what's happening, because you can't just leave it reckless with nothing there. Like that's just going to lead to chaos. So until there's a solution, another system to put in place, I feel like the police have to be there, regardless of whether they're doing bad things at the moment or not. But the power they have is through money and through authority from the government. So that can be cut back. That can be, as we've been saying, they can be defunded from that perspective. But the government can also take away some power in the meantime. And then it leads to what you're saying, and we then go to abolition. But I don't think that we can just take their money, give it to the community, and expect everything to be good in the meantime until a new system comes, because that will lead to chaos.
Yes, but Jonathan, everything has to be incremental though, like Hilla was suggesting. We're not trying to say it's like an immediate boom, like explosion of, okay, suddenly we wake up, why, boom, no police. Like everything comes in. So for example, that analogy you used with school or whatever you said, that's just taking a segment of it and not changing it holistically, because it doesn't change the whole entire school system. So now if you want to come and use that onto what we're talking about, the police system, abolition versus reform, again, it doesn't change it holistically, which still leaves us back to square one essentially with the same problems. Do you know what I'm saying? Exactly. And then another point I want to just tweak on a bit that you said about how we can't just take all the money, throw it onto the community, but it's like what I was saying earlier, you have to prioritize where you're putting the money into. So like I said, demilitarizing the communities, defunding the police, and also investing within care and not cops. So, you know, this could be through things such as allocating city funding towards healthcare, infrastructure, and even youth programs, which again inadvertently go to helping the whole neighborhood / community entirely, without even having to touch on the police like forefront. You know what I'm saying?
I agree.
So I feel like you have to look at the problem holistically though, like Scylla was saying, and it's
incremental. We're still talking about defunding. The matter is, like what you guys are saying, going into abolition, there's still going to be a period where they're defunded. So what's the difference between what you guys are saying and what I'm saying? Like I'm saying defund them, yeah, they're not going to have the money, they're not going to be able to do the things they were doing before, and then we go into abolition. But you guys are saying that won't make the change because it's still the same system, but it's not the same system because they haven't got the things they had before. So the system has changed and it's going to change. But I'm saying, in the meantime, there needs to be some form of system in place. Like there can't just be nothing. You know what I mean? Like that's my point. Like abolition, yeah, it's great, but obviously abolition doesn't happen overnight. So while we're waiting for that overnight period or the period when abolition will happen, there needs to be a system in place. Like we can't just have nothing because America's already corrupt enough. Like it has to be something there. Like,
Amal, do you want to take this one?
Scylla, you go ahead, go on, because you had some points you were trying to take from Jonathan's earlier, then I came in.
Yeah, like, see, defunding, the whole defunding reform abolition thing is very misconstrued because, Jonathan, I still feel like you're not seeing that reform. Yes, you're changing it, but you're changing it within the same thing. Like, if you're going to keep changing the same thing, it's not going to provide any sort of long-term thing, and short-term isn't the way forward. We need to start thinking long-term and how the system can be completely reimagined, completely transformed, because the current US justice system is it's a retributive system. It's very much focused on punishment rather than trying to think of a transformative approach, which abolition will take into consideration. Because sorry, I lost my train of thought. Because they just want to keep as much people in prison as possible, and having this system still there doesn't better communities, doesn't keep people safe. And we also need to reevaluate the actual effectiveness of actually having the police. Because Jonathan, you said like what we're going to do without the police. We're not going to, as Amal said, we're not going to get rid of them immediately. But at the same time, you need to think you need to think about how effectively do a police even deal with issues. A lot of the time, most cases go unsolved, gone unresolved. Like police they don't deal with the things that we do. I think
I agree.
There's a lot of things in place. There's a lot of things in place that over-exaggerate the police effectiveness. So for example, let's take statistics. There's a disproportionate amount of Black people overrepresented in these statistics. It's not that they're policing good and they're catching the criminal, it's that because they're jailing these people more. It doesn't mean that they're good cops, it just means that they're targeting these people more. And I think we need to be, the police aren't that as effective as they are made out to be. That's what I'm trying to.
They're just keeping more tabs on Black people as well. This is the issue you have to
remember. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that the defunding of the police, it's a temporary measure. It's not something that's gonna keep the police. Like the police need to be, the entire system needs to be removed. I think like it just needs to not necessarily getting rid of the police, but if you're not gonna get rid of the police, the way the entire system works, like everything within it, like how they're trained and stuff, how they have to qualify them, like morals that they have to have, that stuff needs to change. But I agree with you guys about the abolition. But like, I mean, we're kind of running down on time at the moment, so I just wanted to quickly end it by obviously saying to you guys how yesterday was a month from the day that George Floyd died, sadly. So obviously the fight it's not over yet. We're still battling to find equality because,
and for many other victims as well, obviously not just
exactly. He was the catalyst for the whole
he's
resparking the movement.
I like that still. I like that.
So guys,
thank you.
Just keep doing what you're doing to raise awareness. Obviously, we're doing this podcast every week. If tell your friends, tell your family, so everyone's becoming aware of these things that we need to know. We need to have educated so that we can make change. Because if we don't make change, the same thing's going to keep happening, and the same thing's going to keep happening, and more Black people are going to die, and we're going to keep having uprise and uproar. But it's not going to be getting us anywhere. We're going to be going in a circle. We don't want to have to keep being violent or keep making our voices loud to be heard. We just want the change to come, because that's what we want. The same thing that will happen for a white person. Change will just come for them, but we want the same thing. So keep doing your part to make this happen, because no matter how small you think it is, you're making a difference. So we thank you guys for watching this. Like, we appreciate you showing your support and just coming and educating yourselves. And we'll be posting it on YouTube, so if you want to listen again, then it'll be there. But anyway, have a blessed day, guys. Stay safe, and we hope that we've educated you in this podcast.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening.